Okay? Notice that we have reports, and if you know anything about government reports, they are always being cited for everything. If you hear anybody speaking in the government, almost always there's going to be some special report that has been released, right? And so here we go with the reports, right? In the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint, which means he always did what he was supposed to do. In everything he did, he served the, notice the capitalization, greater community. Greater community. In other words, always making sure that he fit in and did exactly what he was told. Okay? Except for the war till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired. The fact that he did not get fired and that he worked all his life in a factory proves he was a good guy. Can you get a sense already of the irony or the satire that's being said here? In other words, the fact that he never got fired proves that he was a great guy and he was a great worker. He satisfied his employers, this Fudge Motors Inc., of course probably playing off of the Ford Motors Incorporated, right? He wasn't a scab or odd in his views. For his union reports, he paid his dues, and our report of his union shows it was sound. In other words, he belonged to the union. He was a part of the bigger group, right? And our social psychology workers found he was popular with his mates and liked to drink. In other words, he was normal in every way. Let's write that down. He was normal in every way. The press, notice it's capitalized as another form of the bureaucracy, right? The press are convinced that he bought a paper every day and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. By the way, I should just point out, it's interesting to read this poem as an artifact of our history. Because today, like I said, we don't use the term bureaucracy, we just use the term government. We don't use the term press, we use the term media. I don't know if you follow it at all, but people are always talking about what's wrong with the media and the fact that the media is either left-leaning or right-leaning and they fight against each other and you can't believe anything in the media anymore. It's today called the media, not the press, because back in the time, press was the way you read the newspaper. Of course, today the media is a whole lot more than that, right? Some of you probably do hear the news, but maybe you hear it as a little clip on a radio station you're listening to, or it comes up on your phone as just kind of the headlines or something like that. That's all part of the media. And the point here being that he had the appropriate opinions, right? Notice as well that he was very interested in playing the game of insurance. Policies taking out in his name prove he was fully insured. His health card shows that he was once in hospital but left it cured, right? Everything necessary to the modern man he had. Now this is an interesting list, line 21. Let's write this down. This is what you have in 1940 to be a person who is like everybody else. A phonograph, that is to say like a turntable, a radio, a car, and a Frigidaire. Now, often my juniors will laugh at this idea. What do you mean, a car? Well, this was one of those times in American history when everyone was beginning to just own their own car, and they had a refrigerator in their house. These were kind of big dog deals back in 35 to 36 to 40, okay? Today, of course, that's not a big deal. But now let's ask this question. What is it that makes everybody normal at Worland High School? If you're going to be a student, what are the things you have to have? A lot of students will say, first and foremost is that phone. Got to have a phone. Oh, good heavens, what if I didn't have a phone? Right? Something would be wrong with my life. Somehow it's not fully lived unless I have my phone. Of course, it's interesting to point out, not just any phone. Right? What are some other things? Can you write down anything else that is kind of necessary? Right? It's fascinating that now, today, lots of students report, if you're going to be a student at Worland High School, it's kind of important that you have a vehicle if you're a junior or a senior. You got to have a car. You got to have a vehicle. If you don't have a vehicle, something's wrong with you. This was not the case 25 years ago at Worland High School, right? You could find lots and lots of juniors and seniors. When they graduated from high school, an old beat-up car was their graduation gift. Yeah, no kidding. They weren't given a car before they graduated. Very interesting. For some students, it's the ability to have certain technologies other than a phone, maybe a computer, something like that. Right? Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. In other words, whenever there was an opinion for everybody else, he kind of went along with it. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. In other words, he followed public opinion. He was married, added 5 children to the population, which our eugenicist says was the right number for a parent of his generation. In other words, Auden is imagining living in a time when you're only allowed to have a certain number of children. If you know anything about certain countries in the world, they actually have passed laws that only allow you to have a certain number of children. And that is all. That's all that you can actually have. Our teachers report he never interfered with their education. In other words, he basically allowed for the schools to educate his children instead of sharing his own opinions with his children. This, of course, there's a lot that's been made of this line as well. And the idea that schools should be free to teach kids without parents getting in the way. Auden had serious problems with that idea. Parents should always be teaching their children to challenge things and not just sit back and let the school educate their children. All of that tells us about what he did. Put this in your notes. But fascinatingly, we don't know who he was. Think about that. We know what he did, we just don't know who he was. So, finally the question is asked about who he was. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. And can you jot down what that means? What's the point? Of course he was free. Of course he was happy. To even ask the question is asinine. It's absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. In other words, well, if there was anything wrong, he would have talked about it. He would have told us. Of course, within the poem itself, we recognize not so, right? Our unknown citizen is defined as being a saint because he never told anybody what was wrong. Everything was just fine. In other words, he just got along with everyone else. Okay, so that's level 1. Let's jump to level 2A and finish now our annotations really quickly with this poem. At 2A, messages, themes. Let's talk really quickly about what is the major message for you of this poem, beginning with the title, The Unknown Citizen. Auden is saying what about our society, our modern and now today postmodern, or some argue post-postmodern society? Saying what? Well, many have argued that what he's saying is there's something fundamentally missing in our society, and it's called individuality. To be yourself. To not have to fit in. It's funny, I will often say this to my students, and they hadn't thought about this. Think about the way that a mall is designed to make you want what everyone else has. Think about that. So you walk past a store, you look at the stuff in the front, the pictures, what everyone is wearing, right? And what are you being educated as you look at the pictures in the front of the clothing store? If you want to be, and now you just fill in the adjective, cool, or popular, or accepted, you dress like this. If you want to be happy, right? Notice how all the pictures of people wearing clothes in front of a clothing store, they're always smiling like they're having a great time. What are you being educated to learn? If I want to be happy, I got to dress like those people. Which means, of course, I got to go in and buy their clothes. But everybody else goes in and buys their clothes as well. So that way when I go to school, nobody will laugh at me. Auden was deeply concerned about this corrosive effect on individuality, where people would act and live the way they wanted to. This seems to be a shrinking population of people. What Ralph Waldo Emerson will call a nonconformist, right? Of course, another possible message or theme, the ways in which the bureaucracies, the government, has this tendency to become over-controlling in the lives of people, right? There's laws for everything, which means there's less and less freedoms. As restrictions grow, freedoms shrink. could easily be another one of the major messages here. A third possible message, and this is an interesting one, and it'll keep us at 3B thinking for a while. Is there a difference between being successful and being happy? Whoa, I would write that question down. This is a major message of this poem. There is a huge difference between being successful, right? Making money, having a good job, working, etc., and being happy. Being happy. How do you know when you're happy? Notice the question is considered to be absurd here. What about being free? I'm free to do whatever I want. Well, yes and no. Because it seems like increasingly as we get older and older, we are less free. Why? Because you have to feed yourself, which means you have to get a job, which means you have to go to work. And of course, the kind of money that you can make from your job at work has to do with your education. Very interesting, right? So in what ways are we ever actually free? Of course, at 2B, let's just write it down again. We are already working with this notion of satire. Notice the brilliance of the way Auden is able to resurrect all these questions without actually coming right out and saying it. The final 2 lines of the poem says, how, of course he was happy and free. I mean, we would have been told if he wasn't. The irony, of course, is that, well, no, here's the point. The unknown citizen didn't even think to ask, am I happy? Am I free? I mean, I pointed this out to juniors before. The zombie-like effect of a student at Worland High School. So we sit in our rooms, waiting, looking at the clock. Then what? Ding, 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 ding. And we all get up, and we all walk out the door together, and we all walk down the hall together into the next holding pen, where we sit down. Then wait, looking at the clock, looking at ding, ding, ding. Then we all get up. Well, at least we're free for lunch hour. Whoa, dodge that bullet. But guess what? We have to come back. And guess what? Into another room. Where guess what? Looking at the clock. Ding, ding, ding. In the abstract, we might say about an activity like this, well, that's kind of like recipe for insanity. Right? And you call that your whole day? Your whole life? Well, what happens after you graduate? Well, guess what? You go to a job at the Big Mac. Where guess what? You clock in. Where guess what? You spend all your time looking at the clock. Till you can get out. But then guess what? You got to go back and do it all over again. The next... Whoa. See, Auden was already onto this idea. That somehow the pervasive effect of our life is that we don't realize it until you read a poem like this, and then you go, wow, yeah, how free am I? How happy am I? I'm kind of limited in the options that I have. Whoa, very interesting. The use of satire, of course, by Auden is brilliant in this poem as he represents the notion that, you know, it's so pervasive that there's no reason to ask whether somebody's happy, whether somebody's free. The question is absurd. All right, let's jump to 3A really quickly. Now, this is interesting for juniors because a lot of juniors, when they're asked this question about this poem and how it relates to other titles, at first they're like, I don't know. But then I'll ask this question. What titles are you familiar with in your high school career already that has seemed to suggest that there's not as much freedom as one would like to think? Now, often these titles are what we call utopian critique novels or dysutopian novels. One of the famous ones that we read at Worland High School is a little short novel by an author named Auden Rand, and the title of the book is Anthem. Some of you will immediately recognize, oh, wait a minute, you're talking about a novel where you have people in the story who are not free to do anything except obey the government. Oh, like The Giver. Oh, wait a minute, they live in a society that's quote-unquote perfect. But the only reason it's quote-unquote perfect is because there are not very many options. Everybody's got to do the same thing. Of course, what would happen if you were to stand up and say, enough with the system? Oh yeah, that's called the Hunger Games. And all of a sudden, a good number of my juniors start to go, wait a minute, a lot of the stories and books and movies that I've been exposed to over the last couple of years have challenged me to try to wake up to the reality that either you live your life or it will live you. Or you just kind of go through the actions. Of course, another related text here, if we know Longfellow's classic poem, Psalm of Life, remember it? In this world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb, driven cattle. Be a hero in the strife. Right? Longfellow was already playing the same game Auden is playing. It's very easy to just start to do what everybody else does without thinking about it. See, that's the funny question that a lot of adults ask kids. Well, if so-and-so were to jump off the bridge, would you jump off too? There is an answer to that for most juniors. And the answer is, yeah, I'd jump. You bet I'd jump. Of course I would jump. Right? We're so afraid that somebody might look at us as different. We're so worried that we might be laughed at, that we regularly do things we don't really want to do. What do we call that? Peer pressure. We do it all the time. We don't really want to do that, but we do it. Why? Because somebody might laugh at us. Well, why should we care about that? Because we have to fit in. Why do we have to fit in? Because we don't want to feel alienated. And yet, note the irony. When we're fitting in, all of a sudden the light bulb comes on. And we go, am I happy? Am I free? The question's absurd. Of course, I'm both of those. Really? Auden's poem has a tendency, like reading The Giver, like reading any number of these dystopian novels, like Anthem, to ask the question, how much are you aware of the way in which you don't have a life? A real life. Your life. Something that you've constructed. Right? Of course, we think about Thoreau, we're working now at 3A still, in his classic line from Walden, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. The majority of people, they're not happy with the life they live, but they don't have much of a choice. They got to do what they got to do so they can survive, just like our unknown citizen. Of course, we could ask your favorite movies now that play the same game, fighting the system. Of course, what's your favorite rebellion song? Do you have a favorite rebellion song? Many years ago when I was teaching this poem, there was a band called Rage Against the Machine. And there were, of course, the whole point of that band's lyrics were to try to wake up people, listeners, to their music, to challenge them to somehow move beyond the conformity, the norm. Right? All right, well, 3B is obviously coming, so let's go ahead and jot down a couple of questions that we can think about here. One of the most obvious questions that comes out of the reading of this poem is this simple question. Who are you? What do you mean, who am I? Are you an unknown citizen? Or we might say it today at Worland High School, are you an unknown student? If you were to sit down and write a little poem about a student at Worland High School, unknown student, right? What would we say about the student? Well, passed all the classes, did all the stuff you're supposed to do, went out for the appropriate sports teams, went out for the appropriate activities, blah, blah, blah. Question, are you happy? Wow, that's a very interesting 3B question. Do you even think about the question, are you happy? How about this question? Are you free? I once had a junior that actually said to me, I cannot believe that I've lived 17 years on this planet and never once legitimately asked the question, am I free? How is that even possible? How could I get 17 years into my life and not ask the question, dude, am I free? The ubiquitous nature of society, the pressures on us to conform, make the question, are you happy or are you free, kind of a silly, absurd is the word Auden uses, absurd question. Our final question for you at 3B. What if you were to read a poem I don't know, let's just play the game called the unknown citizen. And all of a sudden the light bulb came on above your head and you went, wait a minute. I've spent my whole life basically just conforming to what all the expectations were everyone was placing on me. I'm going to be different. What would that look like for you? Where would you even start to find yourself? How would you go about doing that? Of course, the other part of this question is, what will you be like at 40? You're almost halfway to 40. You do realize that, right? So what's it going to be like at 40 for you? What kind of person will you be? Will you be a person who is happy? Will you be a person who is free? In spite of all of the pressures of society to make you conform. Can you do that? Do you think you'll be able to pull that off by the age of 40? In other words, when 18-year-olds, people your age, look at you at 40, are they going to see a person who they respect or a person who they pity? Whoa! Because obviously, if you've read this poem correctly, are you supposed to respect this unknown citizen or pity this unknown citizen? Right, this is the whole point of the satire. You're not supposed to respect this person, you're supposed to pity this person. Why? Because this person lived and died and never knew himself. Right? Never knew himself. He was able to do everything else, accomplish everything you're supposed to accomplish, but he never actually knew himself. Of course, back up to 3a, one of the most famous observations from the great Socratic dialogues of Plato, the Delphi oracle is know thyself. And you'll remember what Socrates said right before they killed him, the unexamined life is not worth living. Whoa. You've got to spend your life challenging yourself by asking, are you happy? Are you free?